officers arrived on scene, they saw Christopher Jackson standing in the driveway. He reported that he had just arrived home from working the overnight shift and found that his back door was kicked open. He was upset, very anxious.
Chris stated that his fiancée, Angela, was inside the house, and also their young son, he believed was still in the house.
You could just see the look on Chris's face, that he knew something was wrong and he was fearing the worst.
The officers found the back door of the house. It appeared to be kicked in. There was a noticeable boot print on the white door. The door frame itself was fractured, broken, splintered.
There were 4 of us that went inside. We don't know what's going on in there. We don't know if someone's being held hostage. We don't know if someone's waiting around the corner. So we just went room by room.
The officers made their way into a living room area. They did not notice anything that would be considered out of the ordinary. It was fairly clean and picked up.
They went down the hallway where they found 2 bedrooms. One was locked. They searched the other room across the hall, and that's where they found the young child inside of his crib. He appeared to have been sleeping, wasn't harmed, seemed in good condition. One of the officers picked up the child and took him outside and brought him to his father.
He was relieved to see that his child was unharmed, but that very quickly changed to concern about why isn't Angela out?
After that was completed is when we prepared to enter through the locked door. I stood next to the door while another officer kicked the door open.
They could see a large bed, and as you walked in, you could immediately see that there was blood on the bed, and there appeared to be somewhat of a scuffle.
As I turned the corner between the bed and the wall, I saw a younger white female laying on the floor. She was laying on her back, appeared to be wearing sleeping clothes, covered in blood. It became apparent that she had suffered multiple stab wounds.
They were able to determine that the victim was Angela Wilder, and that she was in fact deceased.
Angela grew up in Alabama. She was very Southern, always nice, always polite. I don't think there was one time where she didn't call me Miss Crystal. She ended up in Minot, North Dakota, and that's where I met her in nursing school. She had a full scholarship for nursing. It was like fulfilling a dream. She liked interior decorating. I said, the only thing I have hanging on my walls is a clock. And she said, I could totally come over and help you figure out where to hang all your pictures. She always talked about how Chris was so sweet and he took the brunt of a lot of the household things because she was so busy with nursing school. She always said nice, wonderful things about him and her children. She did talk about her kids a lot and how much she loved them. She had so much more than just a bright future ahead of her. She had her children's lives to watch them grow up, and that was all taken away from her.
When they looked at Angela's body, they could see blood coagulating behind her head on the floor and on the back of her neck, which told us that she had been dead at least some hours.
It appeared there may have been some possible DNA underneath her fingernails. It appeared that she may have scratched or at least fought briefly with her attacker. So they collected swabs.
With the amount of times that she was stabbed, we definitely knew that whoever attacked Angela had anger and definitely wanted her dead. It did raise a red flag to me that Christopher Jackson did not go into the home when he initially arrived home that morning. We all feel the first thing we would do would be rush in and check on our loved ones. So at this point, we told him we wanted to speak to him and asked him to voluntarily come down to the police department.
There's some water just in case I don't know if you need anything or not. I don't have it at home. Where do you work at?
Walmart.
Walmart? Okay. What do you do at Walmart?
Stock.
Okay. What are the hours for that?
My hours are like 10 to 7.
Okay. So you go into work at 10. Does she give you a ride to work then?
Yeah.
Okay. So walk me through what happened this morning.
I always call her on break.
Okay.
Just to see how she's doing. Just to talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
Because I work nights.
What time's break?
Break is 5.
Did you call her at 5?
Yeah.
Okay. And how did that call go?
It didn't. I figured, okay, she's just tired. But she always picks up whenever I call her.
What time does she usually pick you up from work?
She's usually there about 7, and she's not out there this morning. And I keep calling her. And she's not picking up the phone. So I call a taxi, I get to the house, so I walk around back, and the door is open. And something in my stomach just felt wrong. So I called the cops. The ambulance comes. The guys go in, and they come back out. And there's still no Angela.
Looking at Chris, the way he's sitting right there, he's pretty open. It's not like he's trying to hide anything. He's not crossed legs, not crossed arms. He seemed genuinely hurt in that and heartbroken at that point.
Was Angela working at the time?
No, she just got into nursing.
You guys argue?
Oh yeah, of course, we're in a relationship.
How long in your home you guys leave the doors unlocked?
Except for the front door and the back door. Always leave them locked.
How is your relationship now with Angela?
Oh, it was very stable.
Okay.
We went up to Billings like earlier this week because she was excited because she got a pregnancy test.
So Angela was pregnant?
She was trying to keep it a secret from me for Christmas. She kind of glowed a little bit, so.
I could tell by the way he talked about Angela that he really did love her. His reactions, his emotions, everything seemed very appropriate. I had no evidence that led us to believe that there was anything toxic in his relationship with Angela.
My initial gut feeling at that point was that he probably was not the one who murdered Angela.
What's your guys' typical evening like before you go to work?
We're shut. Nothing seems out of place. You walk by the front window, in between the blinds.
Have any enemies?
There's people that might not like her, but I don't think anybody would be to that point.
I know that you said that the dispatcher told you not to go in the house, that officers were on their way. Did you go into the house?
Something in my stomach said not to.
Okay. So last time you were in the house was when you left for work last night?
Yes, ma'am.
Who would harm Angela if that's the case?
Richie.
Chris told us that Richie Wilder was Angela Wilder's ex-husband. They also shared a biological child together, as well as Angela's firstborn child was adopted by Richie while they were married, and they shared custody of the children.
What's the relationship like with Richie?
If you could name it, they've probably been through it. He doesn't like her, she doesn't like him. He was in the military and he got kicked out because he was beating the out of her and they got divorced over it.
Is he still living in Minot?
So, yeah. We always had to take the kids up to Marketplace Foods Sunday at 5 and I go in there so Angela didn't have to.
Was Sunday the custody exchange then? Is that every week?
Every week.
Okay, has there been anything recent between the two of them? Any verbal, physical contact?
Dirty looks, scowls, bull back and forth.
Richie Wilder and Angela Wilder had a very volatile relationship. There was abuse that was documented. He had a motive for this crime with the custody of the children.
And at that point, it really put Richie on our radar as a person who we need to talk to.
That morning, I was driving to school and drove by her house, and her house was surrounded in yellow tape. I called, got no answer, texted right away, said, "Are you okay?" Got no answer. The next day, I learned that she was gone, that Angela was gone. It was an extreme shock. She was one of the most compassionate, caring people you'll ever meet. It was heartbreaking.
When's the last time you saw Richie?
Last Sunday.
The custody exchange then?
Yeah.
Okay.
We get there and Cindy's sitting over there in a friggin' Honda.
Who's Cindy?
Cindy's Richie's wife. Cindy sits there and scowls at us the entire time. I walk the kids in, tell them I love them and everything. Each time we get the kids back, it's always something about Richie said this or did that. It's always putting us down and just calling us trash.
Okay. I'm gonna step out for just a second. Do you need anything? Are you done with your water? Do you need some more? Okay, let me get you some more water.
Once we were done talking to him, he also agreed to take the polygraph, and he passed that.
We contacted his employer. We were able to get the video of all the cameras in the business. And we were able to confirm that Chris never left his job that night.
Mr. Jackson's alibi was solid. At that point, I was very confident that Christopher Jackson was innocent. So we definitely wanted to get Richie Wilder into the police department so we could see what his story is and see where he was at and see what he had to say about all of this.
That's just right here, is okay? Yeah, you're good. Give me 1 second. Oh, yes, sir. Yep.
Hello, hi, are you Richie?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Richie. My name's Detective Krista McNice, and Sergeant Detective Dave Goodman. I'm not sure what patrol told you or the officers told you when they came up to the house to get you.
I needed to come down and answer questions.
Did they tell you what about?
Well, I got some messages that they text, and then I saw on Facebook that something happened. I don't know. I know my wife, when she drove my daughter to school today, she saw some cars out there.
When we said out there, you're talking about
Maxwell's house.
That's
Angela's house.
Angela's
Yep,
house.
sorry.
Okay.
What happened to your face? I get a scratch in your
Yeah,
face.
that's from my kid.
Well, the first things everybody noticed was he had a small scratch under one of his eyes, which appeared to be pretty fresh, which kind of hyped up everybody's senses right away. Somebody who was stabbed in a violent encounter more than likely struggled. Wouldn't be unrealistic to think that, they might have scratched their assailant.
Okay. And how did that happen?
We play wrestle / play fight. And sometimes he claws me up. He has long fingernails sometimes. So
When did that happen?
that happened yesterday.
And tell me about the scenario of what you guys were doing when that happened.
Oh, just in the living room. I usually get on my knees and we kind of play around.
And the thing I don't want to hear is usually.
Oh,
I mean, tell me exactly what happened.
Oh,
I could see his brain working when I asked him about the scratch. You could tell that he's uncomfortable explaining this, and he keeps falling back on a memory, I believe, of him wrestling with his son. And that was a huge red flag for us.
Okay. Did you work last night?
from 7 to 11, yes, ma'am.
And you were at Trinity that whole time?
Yes, sir. We can't leave the hospital without permission.
Where'd you go after you left work?
Straight home.
Can anybody tell us what time you got home?
Cindy?
Cindy can? Okay. Did you ever leave to go anywhere in the middle of the night?
No, ma'am.
Have you ever been inside her house?
No, sir.
Have you ever made statements to Angela about taking the kids away from her?
What did that cost between the two of you then? You consider yourself a smart man, Richie?
Depending on what it is.
You can certainly put 2 and 2 together, right?
Yes.
So what is the 2 and 2 that you've put together in this situation?
Well, somebody passed away. I know that. I just don't know who.
We're doing an investigation here, and obviously this is serious. We have you down
Yes.
here. And I'll tell you, Angela's dead. But what do you know about that?
Know about what?
About Angela being dead?
Nothing, just what you said.
I'll tell you what, there's a lot of fingers pointing right at you.
Well, yeah. Because I'm her ex-husband, right?
Well, you're her ex-husband, and you guys have a volatile relationship. Did you hurt her?
No.
Did you kill her?
No.
No?
No. I don't know anything about it.
Your DNA is not going to show up anywhere on her? Going to show up on her fingernails? Your DNA is not going to show up in her house?
No. I've never been to her house. And if I did, I would tell you.
If anybody ever accused me of something I didn't do, I'd be angry, but he was very calm and non-caring, just sits there quiet. It just didn't make much sense. You know, I try and think of people that would benefit from this. And again, it brings me back to you, but it also brings me to Cindy. I mean, it could be something maybe that Cindy's just tired of dealing with. All this pain in the ass custody. Do you think she killed Angela?
Not Cindy.
How confident are you on that?
100%.
Would you take a polygraph exam?
I mean, yeah, if I need to. I gotta know how. I want to get to the bottom of it because I want to clear my name.
Okay. Yeah. Let's start with the polygraph. You'll be here at 8 o'clock tonight?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to grab a camera and just take some pictures of your scratch on your face. And we'd like to look through your phone and your vehicle and your wife's vehicle.
Okay.
Just put your hands straight out. Can you lift your shirt up for me? Sure. Where are you?
T-shirt and jeans. All right, now this is with your hand and swab would be good. Richie was high on our person of interest list at that point.
It was obvious that we had rattled his cage and that he was uncomfortable. I wanted him to understand that we're not going to go away. I wanted him to go home with that thought in his mind that he's in trouble.
She confirmed that, Richie came right home from work. She claimed that she woke up in the middle of the night. He was still in bed beside her. He was there all night. We suspected that she might have been covering for Richie, but she didn't seem all that concerned that Angela was dead and that she'd been murdered. It was just strange.
When the crime scene team processed the Honda Pilot, one of the crime scene officers located a small dot on the passenger door. It was dark brown in color and smaller than a pencil eraser.
It came back as human blood. So we sent the blood in for DNA testing.
At that point, it becomes a waiting game.
It just kind of all added up to just more and more suspicious. Shouldn't take that much effort to say, yeah, I'll do this if you're not involved. We're pretty well in agreement that this is our prime suspect. Every little piece we had was pointing right towards Richie Wilder. Richie worked in a local hospital, and they found out rather quickly that Richie was very popular with some of the female co-workers.
Richie was having affairs with different women throughout the hospital. He really wasn't the greatest guy when it came to how he would treat women, but that doesn't help us build our case against him as a murderer. We just have to keep following up on everything we can think of. About a month after the murder, we did receive a call from the North Dakota State Crime Lab. They told us that the swab taken from the Honda Pilot was Angela Wilder's blood. Finding Angela Wilder's blood in Cynthia Wilder's Honda Pilot was a huge break for us. It was a very emotional moment.
Angela's DNA should not have been in that vehicle. Ultimately, we got the DNA back from the fingernail scrapings of Angela that showed Richie's DNA underneath there. That was the breaking moment in this case. Took him to the police department, and Richie lawyered up. He wasn't going to talk to us anymore.
At this point, we highly suspected that she had information about the homicide. She lied during the first interview when she said that he didn't leave anywhere during the night. We knew that she was going to stick to her story, so we had to say something shocking that would change the course of that.
We have Richie down here. Do you know why we have Richie down here?
We've arrested Richie for the murder of Angela Wilder.
You tell me?
We want you to be honest with us this time.
I have nothing to say.
Cindy, we have a lot that we want to share with you too, stuff that I would think that you would want to know. I don't mean any disrespect by saying this, Cindy. I'm a little bit confused about your relationship with Richie. I know he's your husband, but I'll tell you what, you don't fit the criteria of the other women that he's sleeping with.
My
Not at all.
husband's not a cheater. Do not accuse him of that.
Oh, we don't
Oh, I
have
can
to
prove
accuse
that.
him, we have proof. This was Jennifer, and Jennifer told us about the sexual relationship she's had with Richie since the beginning of the year.
Well, then
That's-
that's awesome.
We're
Congratulations
not
for them.
trying to offend you or piss you off with that information.
Because I know it's not true.
We can play the recordings.
Know who this is?
No.
That's another one.
He's got relationships with all three of these women. And
Well, I want to see proof of that.
I've
Do you have
got-
it on video?
We have Joanne on video saying it.
I don't want to see a video of them saying I want to see a video of them having sex with my husband. That's what I want.
Cindy,
I don't
that's-
believe you until I see that. I trust my
Let me
husband
tell you something,
100%.
She's Steven in his phone.
Well, he is busy. He's very busy.
I don't give two
I feel for you. And it's absolute bull that he had this whole other life.
My gut feeling right now, Cindy, is that this isn't fair to you. Richie did something horrible. And you know it. But it's time to be honest with us and tell us the truth. Why did he do it? Because he hates her? Because of money? Because of the children? Why?
I don't know anything else. So.
She was definitely playing the loyal wife, but I thought there was more to it, and I felt like she had information on how and when and what happened to clothing that might have had blood on it, and I wanted her to break.
Did you know that Angela was pregnant? She was. She was pregnant when Richie killed her.
Don't say that.
It's the
did.
truth. That's the evidence that we've
change
gathered.
What evidence?
It's scientific
What's the-
evidence.
We have DNA evidence that we took from the Honda. That we
Of
took
course,
off.
there would be Richie's
No, no.
DNA in my Honda.
Whose DNA shouldn't be in the Honda?
Whose blood should not be in the Honda?
Nobody's blood has ever been in the Honda.
Whose blood do you think was in the Honda?
I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you, Angela's blood. There's blood on the passenger door of that vehicle that belongs to Angela. How did that get there?
Well, I don't know why her blood would be on our door if she supposedly died in her house.
Because who killed her was in your car. That's all.
We want you to tell us what you know. That's why we're sharing these things. Because we know you know more. Were you with him when he did this?
Exactly.
Did he stay at the house at all that night?
Yes, he came home after work.
Okay. What time did he leave the house?
He didn't leave the house that
Yes,
night.
he did.
Did leave the house that night.
No, he didn't. I was up several times with the kids and he was out cold.
That's not true.
That's not true.
My goal here is just for you to be honest with us and tell us what you know. Are you going to tell us, Cindy?
I don't have anything to tell.
If you don't want to talk now, I beg of you to please reconsider and call us.
We highly suspected that Cynthia was involved in more ways than one, but we didn't have evidence against her at that point.
I never got a good feeling about Cynthia, but there's nothing we could charge her with at that time. And she is free to leave.
Richie wanted to give this information because he was looking for some sort of deal. So that's when we set up the interview to take place in the sheriff's office in their conference room. All right, the video recorder's recording.
Start whenever you're ready.
Start.
Well, we understand that that you have some information that you want to share with us. And it's my understanding that you want to share your involvement in this crime, this homicide.
So Chris said he kind of came up with an idea to, like, where I could get full custody of my kids and he could get full custody of his. 'Cause I guess they were, having some issues. And I was like, okay, what do you want? And he said he thought that Angela was cheating on him. And he said when he goes to work that he thought somebody was coming over. He's like, we'll catch him in bed and then you can testify for me in court against her that she's cheating on me and then we both get full custody. So I was like, yeah, sure, you're gonna help me, I'm gonna help you. That sounds good to me. But he called me that night. He's like, why don't you come down and get me? And then, we'll head up and catch him in the act. So I got in the car, drove to Walmart, picked him up, drove back to his house. We got out of the car. When he unlocked the door, we went in.
Tell me exactly what you saw when you went.
Oh, okay. We went up some stairs, and then we went through a room. That was like their bedroom. And it looked like there was two people in the bed, And so as he pulled back the cover, the first thing I noticed, there wasn't a person. That was a body pillow. But he grabbed her, and he just started like making a motion. He just kept stabbing her. I ran over there. She leaned up and scratched the mess out of my face. She was just like, I love you. And he just started stabbing her more. And I was like, what the are you doing?
It was just the most far-fetched fantasy, I think. There's no other way to put it. At this point, he'd had several months of sitting in the jail to try to concoct a story. And when I heard it, I'm like, this is the best he could do, is Chris did it.
What did he say?
He just said, he's like, I'm serious. He's like, if you tell anybody, he's like, I'm gonna kill your wife, I'm gonna kill your little one.
Okay.
He never said their names, he just kept saying your wife and your little one.
I know from your admission that you were there. But it doesn't fit. Because I know that Chris did not leave Walmart during the hours that you say that he did.
He did though.
I know he didn't because I watched him on video. I watched him at work.
I didn't kill anybody.
I think you killed Angela.
Yeah, I told you Chris did.
You can stop anytime you want.
Stop.
Okay. I appreciate you talking to us. We were preparing with the idea that Richie Wilder was going to lie to us. Our plan was to let him tell his story and just let those lies bury him. There was so much that he locked himself into, describing the inside of the house, describing how Angela's body was. We won this little battle in this entire war of a case.
This afternoon, the jury convicted Richie Wilder of murdering his ex-wife Angela in her Northwest Minot home last November.
Richie's current wife, Cynthia, remained resolute in her husband's innocence.
I stand by him.
We can't ask for a better sentence than life without parole, so we were happy with that.
It's almost like we know she did something, but we just can't prove it. Cynthia went about her life at that point. So that's the frustrating part, because you know that there's more.
The Minot Police Department received a call in March of 2017 from a Matt Walters.
He'd said that he has possible information about the murder of Angela Wilder.
We called him just to see if this was really true.
Good afternoon, is this Matt?
This is.
Matt, Detective Matthijs calling from the Minot Police Department. Some information was passed along to me. I wanted to follow up with you.
So it's kind of torn for a while on whether I can call you guys. Do you know Cindy?
Cindy, in relation to what?
So her husband is the guy that he's the one that stabbed that woman a couple years back, and he's in jail right now for it.
Are
they
you
just tried him.
About Richie Wilder?
Yes, Richie Wilder. Over the last 3 to 4 months, she just keeps saying stuff that is very unnerving, like hinting that she had something to do with it.
She heavily insinuated through Facebook messages that she was involved in the murder that her husband committed.
Would you be able to send me all those messages?
Yeah, I can screenshot them and send them to you. Immediately after that, she says, it wasn't supposed to be a knife, and you were the only person I have said anything to. That one really raised the hair on the back of my neck.
Mr. Walters had a good conscience and said that this just wasn't sitting well with him, and he wanted to sign up as a confidential informant. We're very excited. We knew that this was our chance to hold her responsible for the role that she played. We basically wanted to get it in her words instead of in typed messages that she could have argued somebody else was typing. He went to Cindy's house. They sat outside in a parked car for a good couple of hours, and they talked, and a lot of it was just small talk. We knew that Mr. Walters was trying to get her just comfortable talking to him again.
I had a really good time. I mean, it's good. We're talking, connecting.
It's nice to get out of the house and laugh. I mean, I haven't laughed in a long time. I've just become this negative.
Cynical?
Yeah, that hateful, like, I don't know. I'm just mad all the time, and I don't know why.
About what?
I don't know. That's the problem.
Are you mad at your husband?
No, like, I'm proud of him. I'm just pissed that he got caught and that he got sloppy and impatient, and I thought we were like in the clear. And it all kind of started as like a joke. Like, I asked him, like, have you ever killed anybody? Just like, bitch needs to die. Like, because we like had this thing like planned for like 2 years, and we were just waiting on.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. Like,
Jesus.
I helped him. Like, I would leave, like, when he worked nights, I would leave the house at like midnight and like sit outside her house in my vehicle seeing who came into the house. Yeah, we had this planned out, and he it up.
I mean, how did, but like...
Because he didn't clean the car good enough. One spot of blood in my car. He just has like so much anger towards her. That's why he couldn't just do one jab to the jugular and get out. No, he like went psycho on her.
I don't know, a knife's a stupid way to kill somebody.
Yeah.
So once you realized it was real, then what? Like...
And I just had to stick with, he was home with me all night.
To be honest, I thought you were full of when you told me before that he was home with you all night.
Yeah, I could go to jail for a very long time because I helped him.
I think Cynthia Wilder was proud of her involvement in this. I never felt that Cindy had any remorse at all for what happened to Angela. So when we heard her make those damning statements, we reached back and high-fived because we knew that we had her at that point.
There's been another arrest in connection with the 2015 Minot murder.
The wife of convicted murderer Richie Wilder was arrested today and charged with conspiracy in the murder of Wilder's ex-wife.
It was ultimate justice. It's kind of karma coming back and biting her. She was 100% involved in this murder, and she fortunately spilled it all to the wrong person.
The Minot woman who pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder will spend the rest of her life in jail.
Cynthia Wilder was sentenced today in a hearing where the judge went well beyond the recommendations of both the defense and prosecution.
You were the one person who could have intervened. You were the one person who could have spared Angela Wilder's life. You chose not to do so.
The life in prison sentence with no parole is the exact same sentence that her husband Richie Wilder is now serving for killing Angela Wilder.
It was an awesome feeling knowing that we were going to get further justice for Angela Wilder and put behind bars everybody who's responsible for her not being here today.
I think Angela should be remembered as the sweet, kind person that she was, always willing to help others, put others before herself. She just had so much compassion and so much caring.
A phone rings in the dark, not once, but again and again, echoing through a patrol office that has already seen too many unanswered calls, too many names that never came home, too many files stamped with the same word, missing. It is 1982, and the south edge of Seattle is swallowing people whole. Not metaphorically, literally. One by one, young women vanish from highways, bus stops, motel corridors, the margins of a city that refuses to look too closely at its own shadows. The media begins to whisper a name it does not yet understand. Green River, a stretch of water that moves quietly through King County, indifferent, patient, collecting what is left behind. At first, the bodies appear like accidents, then like warnings, then like something far more deliberate. A shallow grave off a logging road. A field that should have been empty but isn't. A riverbank where the earth looks disturbed, as if it has been breathing wrong. Each discovery lands with the same silence before the storm. Officers arriving too late, tape going up too slow, families already collapsing somewhere off camera. And then the pattern emerges, sharp and undeniable. Victims are young, often vulnerable, often forgotten long before they are missing. Sex workers, runaways, women living at the edges of systems that were never built to hold them. The killer does not choose loudly. He chooses invisibly, and that is what makes the city afraid to speak. Detectives begin to map the geography of absence. The Green River Task Force is formed, not with confidence, but with exhaustion. Files stack into walls. Evidence bags multiply like a language no one can translate fast enough. Every lead is a corridor that leads nowhere. Every suspect dissolves under scrutiny. The pressure is not just to solve it. It is to keep up with it. Then the river gives them its name and blood. More bodies surface. More distances collapse between crime scenes. The killer is not random. He is organized. He is returning to familiar ground. The highway corridors. The industrial backroads. The places where headlights fade too quickly and witnesses are already gone. And still no face. In interrogation rooms, lit too brightly, detectives replay the same question until it loses meaning. Who is doing this? And why does he know the city better than the city knows itself? Profiles are drafted, revised, discarded. The killer is described as methodical, controlled, possibly local. Someone who blends in. Someone who watches. Someone who has already been seen by dozens of people who did not know what they were looking at. Outside, panic spreads unevenly. Families begin to warn daughters not to hitchhike, not to walk alone, not to trust the wrong car slowing beside the curb. But fear does not stop disappearance. It only changes its shape. In 1984, the case becomes something else entirely. Not just a series of murders, but a statistical horror expanding beyond control. Dozens of victims, possibly more. The river is no longer just a place, it is a ledger, and every entry is still being written. Investigators begin to suspect a serial offender operating with unusual patience. Someone who selects, transports, disposes. Someone who returns to the scene not out of compulsion, but calculation. The idea is chilling because it suggests intention over impulse, control over chaos. And then, a break that feels too small to matter arrives like a fracture in glass. A surviving victim. Barely. Disoriented. Alive in a way that feels almost accidental. Her account is fragmented, broken by trauma and time, but it introduces something the investigation has been missing: proximity. The killer is not a rumor. He is physical. He is close enough to touch, close enough to speak, close enough to be remembered in pieces that refuse to form a clear picture. A sketch is attempted. It looks like 1,000 people and no one at once. Still, the net tightens. Surveillance increases along the highways. Undercover operations begin in the nightlife corridors where victims were last seen. Officers move through bars, parking lots, truck stops, trying to intercept a shadow that keeps adjusting its shape. But the killer adapts. Each new body is a message that the search is still too slow. Each delay in identification is another silence he exploits. Years begin to fold into each other. 1985, 1986. The case does not cool. It hardens. It becomes heavier, more defined, more impossible to ignore. The task force grows, then strains under its own weight. Detectives rotate in and out, carrying fragments of a puzzle that refuses completion. And somewhere in that expanding darkness, a question begins to surface. Not about where he is, but how he has stayed invisible for so long in a city now looking directly at its own worst map. Because by now, the Green River is no longer just a river. It is a system, and systems do not break easily. They are dismantled, one piece at a time, and the first piece is still missing. The file does not cool. It mutates. By 1987, the Green River investigation has become something heavier than a manhunt. It is a living archive of failure and persistence, locked in fluorescent-lit rooms where detectives speak in low voices and point at walls covered in photographs that never seem to stop multiplying. Faces of women who once stood under streetlights, who once waited at bus stops, who once believed distance could protect them. Now they are pinned to boards like evidence of a war no one declared. The river itself is no longer the only dumping ground. Bodies are found in ravines, wooded slopes, construction sites where earth has been turned and returned like a nervous hand searching for something it cannot name. The geography expands. So does the fear. And still the pattern holds. The killer does not drift. He returns to structure. He revisits comfort zones. He selects from populations already ignored by the systems meant to protect them. Each victim is a data point in a design that investigators are still struggling to decode. But there is one detail that begins to sharpen in the noise: timing. The disappearances are not random across the calendar. They cluster. They pulse, as if driven by something internal, cyclical, deliberate. Inside the task force, exhaustion becomes doctrine. Detectives sleep in chairs, eat at desks, forget what daylight feels like. Files are no longer read. They are endured. Every name becomes a weight. Every new report a reminder that the count is still climbing. Then the investigation shifts. Not forward, sideways. A new theory emerges. The killer may not be operating in isolation. He may be interacting with the city in ways previously dismissed as coincidence. Truck routes, industrial corridors, areas of transient populations. A mobile offender, possibly tied to long-haul logistics, or someone who moves through the city without anchoring to it. The idea spreads, fragile but persistent, and with it comes a widening of suspect pools that threatens to drown the investigation in its own ambition. Hundreds of names, thousands of interviews, endless contradictions, and yet no closure. Outside the task force, the city begins to develop its own mythology. Taxi drivers whisper routes to avoid. Sex workers share survival codes. Newspapers print headlines that feel like warnings carved too late. River of death. Serial killers still at large. Police baffled as bodies increase. But inside the investigation, the tone is not sensational. It is colder, more technical, more desperate in its restraint. Because somewhere in the data, something is not aligning. Witness descriptions vary wildly. Vehicle sightings conflict. The sketch remains useless. And yet, the killer continues to operate with precision. That contradiction becomes its own kind of obsession. In 1988, the case receives renewed attention. Federal resources increase. New forensic techniques are introduced. Evidence is re-examined under evolving standards. What once was invisible begins to show faint outlines under improved scrutiny. But progress is slow, painfully slow, and the killer continues. Another victim, another location, another silence. Then, a shift that does not come from the river, but from the interrogation room. A suspect surfaces briefly, almost accidentally. A man questioned in connection to unrelated crimes. His name enters the system like a ripple. Not flagged, not prioritized, just logged. But something about him lingers. Not evidence, not confession. Pattern. He lives within the geography of the crimes, moves through the same corridors, has a history that does not fully align with his present. Yet still, nothing concrete attaches. He is released, and the task force, already drowning in possibilities, lets him slip back into the city. Time continues its erosion. By the late 1980s, public pressure intensifies. Families of victims organize, refusing silence. They demand accountability not just for the killer, but for the delay itself. Why so many years? Why so many missed chances? Why does the system only accelerate after death become statistics instead of prevention? The question haunts press conferences. Detectives cannot answer it cleanly. Because the truth is fragmented. Not a single failure, but a chain of constraints. Limited forensic tools, overwhelmed manpower, jurisdictional friction, and a killer who understands invisibility as strategy. And still, the river does not give up its dead easily. Each new discovery resets the emotional clock. A body recovered is both closure and reopening. Families are notified in rooms where time stops, but does not heal. Identification processes drag through dental records, clothing fragments, missing person files that have aged into archives of grief. In one such case, a personal item becomes a focal point. A small artifact recovered with remains. Something ordinary, something human. It connects victim to life, even as the investigation tries to connect victim to death. But even that is not enough to break the case open. By 1989, frustration begins to reshape strategy. The task force narrows its focus. Instead of expanding outward, they begin to tighten inward, re-examining known offenders, revisiting interviews, reconstructing timelines with obsessive precision. And in that narrowing, a subtle pattern begins to emerge, not in the victims, but in the geography of suspects previously dismissed. One name reappears in scattered documents, not prominent, not highlighted, but present in enough peripheral context to resist disappearance. A man who fits the background noise of the investigation. Someone who does not stand out in memory, but survives in paperwork. Still, there is no direct link. Only repetition. And repetition, in a case like this, is never ignored for long. Because the Green River does not forget. It accumulates. And somewhere beneath the weight of years, beneath the layering of bodies and theories and false starts, the investigation begins to converge, not toward resolution yet, but toward proximity. Closer than before. Closer than anyone wants to admit. And still the river keeps moving, as if it already knows the ending. The city begins to change its behavior before the case changes its shape. By 1990, Seattle is no longer just reacting to the Green River killings. It is anticipating them. Every disappearance is treated like a possible return of something already familiar. Patrol patterns shift. Public warnings tighten. The language of safety becomes conditional, provisional, always trailing behind events instead of preventing them. Inside the task force, the atmosphere has hardened into something almost mechanical. Investigators no longer speak in theories first. They speak in constraints. What can be proven? What can be placed in a timeline? What can survive scrutiny in court? Everything else is noise, and there is far too much noise. But the river does not care about procedural discipline. It continues to surface what was hidden. Another set of remains is recovered along a remote stretch of wooded land, miles from the earlier clusters. The location is different, but the feeling is not. The same absence of struggle in the soil. The same calculated concealment. The same unsettling suggestion that the killer is not improvising, but executing a familiar routine with variations. The forensic teams work faster now, but speed does not equal clarity. Time has already done its damage. Identification becomes a slow reconstruction of identity from fragments, bone density, dental records, scraps of fabric, partial belongings that survived exposure longer than the person who owned them. Each confirmation lands like a muted impact. Another name added. Another file reopened. Another family drawn back into a moment they thought they had already survived. And still, no collapse in the investigation's central mystery. The killer remains structurally absent, present in consequence, absent in form. Then the focus shifts again, not because of breakthrough evidence, but because of pressure building at every edge of the case. The task force begins to refine its internal map, not of victims, but of time. When do the disappearances cluster? When do they pause? When does the system of violence accelerate? And when does it briefly stop? Patterns begin to form with uncomfortable clarity. There are gaps in activity, weeks where nothing happens, then sudden bursts, as if the offender is not only acting, but withdrawing, living a parallel rhythm of normalcy between episodes of violence. That idea changes everything and nothing at once, because it implies proximity, a life that continues, a routine that blends, a person who disappears into ordinary environments without friction. The investigative lens narrows again. Suspects are reevaluated not just for capability, but for consistency with absence. Who vanishes during key periods? Who travels? Who cannot be accounted for in ways that are verifiable rather than assumed? In this tightening framework, one profile begins to resist elimination. Not because it proves anything, because it refuses to break under pressure. A man previously questioned in peripheral contexts returns to attention through administrative overlap, employment records, geographic proximity, indirect associations with locations tied to victims. Each connection alone is meaningless. Together, they form something more uncomfortable: recurrence. Still, investigators hesitate, because recurrence is not proof. And this case has punished certainty before. The task force has learned, painfully, that confidence without evidence is just another form of error. So the file remains open but not elevated. And the river continues to add to its ledger. Public attention intensifies again as media coverage cycles back into peak visibility. Documentaries begin to frame the killings as something almost mythic in scale, a shadow moving through decades, a presence that reshapes the city's sense of vulnerability. But inside the investigation, there is no mythology, only fatigue sharpened into discipline. Then, in a quiet procedural development that does not immediately register as transformative, a decision is made to revisit archived evidence with renewed forensic capability. Materials that were previously inconclusive are reprocessed under updated methods. Items that have been logged and stored but never fully exhausted are pulled back into active review. Is slow work, repetitive, technical, unremarkable on the surface. But beneath it, something shifts. Because old evidence does not change, but interpretation does. And interpretation, when applied repeatedly across a large enough dataset, begins to produce convergence. Still no face emerges. Still no confession. But the edges of the unknown begin to tighten. At the same time, field investigators intensify their focus on behavioral reconstruction. Instead of asking who the killer is, they begin asking how he moves through space without disruption. What jobs allow mobility without scrutiny? What social environments normalize irregular presence? What routines make absence unremarkable? This line of inquiry does not yield answers immediately. It yields categories. Truck routes, contract work, temporary labor, transitional housing, systems built for movement rather than permanence. And in those systems, investigators begin to understand something crucial. Invisibility is not accidental. It is structural. It is supported by environments that do not retain memory of individuals for long. The killer, if he exists within this logic, is not hiding in darkness. He is moving through light that forgets. As 1991 approaches, the case enters a phase that feels less like investigation and more like compression. Fewer new leads, more reprocessing, less expansion, more focus. The volume of data does not decrease, but its direction changes. Everything begins to point inward, even if nothing yet points clearly enough to act upon. And then, almost without warning, a procedural intersection occurs. Two previously separate investigative threads, behavioral profiling and geographic mapping, begin to overlap in ways that were not fully recognized before. Not because new evidence appears, but because old evidence is being seen differently at the same time. A location pattern repeats. A behavioral window repeats. A suspect history begins to align with both. Still not enough. Still not direct. But closer than anything before it. And in the Green River investigation, closeness has always been the most dangerous stage. Because it creates the illusion of arrival. And arrival, so far, has never been real. By the early 1990s, the investigation no longer expands outward. It tightens inward with surgical restraint. Every new review is a return to old ground, but seen through sharper instruments, colder logic, and a growing awareness that the killer has never been as distant as the initial panic suggested. The task force now operates like a system under sustained pressure. Personnel rotate, but the case does not. It stays fixed, accumulating attention, consuming hours, rewriting priorities across multiple agencies. The Green River file is no longer just an active investigation. It is a gravitational center. And still, the river yields nothing that resembles resolution. Another set of remains is confirmed. Another cluster of missing persons is reclassified. Each confirmation is procedural on paper, but devastating in practice. Families are pulled back into rooms where time has already stopped once before. The language of notification remains unchanged, but its impact never diminishes. Meanwhile, investigators begin to refine something more elusive than evidence: consistency of behavior. The killer is no longer being studied as a sequence of crimes, but as a repeating operational pattern, where he chooses, when he pauses, how he re-engages. It is a rhythm buried beneath years of violence, and it is beginning to surface. A critical observation emerges. The killings do not simply cluster in time. They cluster around specific corridors of movement. Industrial zones, highway interchanges, transitional spaces where people pass through but rarely remain. Places designed for flow, not memory. That realization reframes everything, because it suggests the offender is not only selecting victims, but selecting environments that erase witnesses, absorb anomalies, and dissolve continuity. The city itself becomes part of the mechanism. Inside the task force, a shift occurs in investigative philosophy. The focus moves further away from speculative identity and deeper into reconstructive modeling. If the killer cannot yet be named, perhaps he can be bounded, defined by constraints rather than characteristics. What environments allow repeated access without detection? What occupations normalize irregular schedules? What forms of mobility leave minimal trace? The answers do not point to one person, but they narrow the field. And narrowing, in this case, is progress. Still, progress is slow enough to feel like stasis. Then comes a moment that does not announce itself as decisive, but later proves to be structural. A renewed review of historical interviews begins. Old witness statements, previously dismissed as inconsistent or unreliable, are re-examined with an emphasis on overlap rather than contradiction. Inconsistencies begin to compress into shared fragments. Descriptions that once seemed unusable begin to align in subtle ways. Physical build, general demeanor, vehicle-type impressions, behavioral notes from encounters that lasted only seconds. Nothing concrete emerges, but repetition begins to matter more than certainty. At the same time, forensic advancements continue to reshape the evidentiary landscape. Items collected years earlier are reprocessed, yielding incremental improvements in clarity. Not breakthroughs in the dramatic sense, but refinements. Details that were once too faint to register, now holding measurable weight. A trace here, a partial match there, each one insufficient alone, but collectively forming a tightening perimeter around possibilities. And within that perimeter, certain individuals reappear across unrelated datasets. Not as suspects, as recurring presences. Men who surface in employment records tied to relevant geographies. Men who appear in peripheral witness contexts. Men who move through the same logistical ecosystems as the crimes without ever being anchored to them. One profile begins to withstand elimination attempts not through strength of evidence, but through persistence across categories. Still, investigators resist drawing lines too aggressively, because this case has punished premature certainty before. Every assumption has to survive not just logical scrutiny, but procedural validation. Anything less collapses under courtroom standards. So the name remains in circulation without elevation. A latent possibility, not an active accusation. Outside the investigation, the city's memory of fear has matured into something quieter but more enduring. The public is no longer reacting to each new case with shock. Instead, there is resignation layered over vigilance. People adjust behavior not in response to headlines, but to habit formed over years of uncertainty. And yet, the disappearances continue to echo through the system. Each new discovery is smaller in volume, but heavier in implication. Fewer clusters, more isolated finds, as if the pattern is not expanding anymore, but refining itself. Then, a subtle but important change occurs in investigative focus. Temporal correlation begins to matter as much as spatial correlation. When victims disappear relative to known events in suspect movements becomes a new axis of analysis. Schedules are reconstructed, work histories mapped, travel logs examined with renewed intensity. And in that reconstruction, gaps begin to stand out more sharply than alignments. Periods where presence cannot be fully accounted for. Periods that align, even loosely, with known activity windows of the offender. Still not definitive, but increasingly difficult to ignore. The case begins to feel less like a search and more like a tightening orbit. Every cycle brings investigators closer to a center they still cannot see. And that center, whatever it is, has remained stable for years. Unmoved by pressure. Unchanged by pursuit. As if it has been waiting, not to be found in a sudden moment of discovery, but to be reached through accumulation. Piece by piece. Layer by layer. Until denial is no longer sustainable. And still, the river continues to run through the city as if nothing beneath its surface has ever changed. By the mid-1990s, the Green River case is no longer defined by new violence alone, but by the weight of everything already known and still not understood. The investigation has become a structure built over time, layer upon layer of interviews, reports, forensic revisions, behavioral models, and dead ends that refuse to collapse into a single conclusion. The task force now operates with a kind of disciplined exhaustion. Every action is deliberate. Every lead is filtered through years of accumulated failure. There is no room left for impulsive interpretation. Only verification matters. And yet, the river still speaks in the same language it has always used: absence. Another identification is confirmed from remains recovered years earlier. Another family notified. Another file closed in paperwork, but never in reality. Each closure is administrative. Emotionally, nothing closes. The past keeps reopening itself in different forms at different times with the same finality. But beneath the repetition, something begins to shift in how investigators interpret the totality of the case. It is no longer just about where victims were taken. It is about how the offender moves through systems that are designed to absorb movement without registering intent. Industrial corridors remain central. Truck routes, transient work zones, service areas along highways, spaces where people appear briefly and vanish without traceable continuity. The killer does not need to hide in these environments. He only needs to belong to them long enough to become unremarkable. That realization begins to sharpen the investigative framework. Attention turns increasingly toward occupational patterns that permit geographic fluidity without scrutiny. Jobs that involve travel, irregular hours, or minimal supervision. Roles where presence is inconsistent by design, not by exception. As this lens narrows, the suspect universe changes shape again. Some individuals drop out entirely under scrutiny. Others persist across multiple analytical categories, never fully explained, never fully eliminated. Among them, one presence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, not because of any single incriminating detail, but because of cumulative alignment across unrelated datasets. Employment history intersects with geographic clusters. Known residences sit within operational corridors. Recorded movements, though incomplete, occasionally align with critical time windows. Still, investigators do not escalate prematurely. Because escalation requires more than pattern recognition. It requires evidentiary anchoring. And anchoring has not yet occurred. Parallel to this, forensic review continues its slow transformation of old evidence into new possibility. Advances in testing methods allow previously unusable materials to be re-examined with greater sensitivity. The process is methodical, repetitive, and often inconclusive, but it is no longer static. Each incremental improvement creates small fractures in old assumptions, not dramatic breakthroughs, but adjustments in probability, slight shifts in confidence, narrowing margins of uncertainty. In a case like this, those margins matter, because certainty has always been the missing component. Meanwhile, behavioral analysis reaches a more refined stage. The killer is no longer viewed as a singular profile, but as a system of constraints operating within a human life. Investigators focus on predictability under anonymity. How someone can commit repeated acts of extreme violence and still return to ordinary social structures without collapse or exposure. That question produces an uncomfortable conclusion. The offender is not constantly outside society. He is periodically fully inside it. That duality becomes central. Violence does not replace normal life. It interrupts it, then recedes, then returns. This pattern reframes everything previously assumed about isolation. The killer is not necessarily detached. He is compartmentalized. And compartmentalization is harder to detect than isolation. As investigative models refine, timelines are reconstructed with greater precision. Victim disappearances are mapped against suspect availability windows with increasing detail. What once appeared as scattered events begins to show faint temporal clustering, periods of heightened activity followed by stretches of complete silence. That silence becomes as important as the violence itself, because it implies recovery, reset, and return. Still, no single suspect fully encapsulates the model. But one continues to resist elimination across multiple investigative layers. Not through dramatic evidence, but through survival of repeated analytical filtering. And in a long-running case, survival of scrutiny becomes its own form of relevance. Outside the investigative center, public attention has diminished compared to earlier years, but the case has not disappeared. It has instead become embedded in institutional memory. A reference point for serial crime, for investigative complexity, for systemic limitation. Families and advocacy groups continue to press for final answers, not in bursts of outrage, but in sustained pressure. The demand is no longer just for justice. It is for completion, for an end state that never fully arrives. Inside the task force, however, completion feels distant, because the case no longer behaves like a linear problem. It behaves like a closed system with missing variables. And those variables are still unknown. Then, a quiet but consequential development occurs. Renewed consolidation of all suspect data into a unified analytical framework. Previously separate databases, interviews, vehicle records, employment histories, geographic mapping, are merged for cross-comparison at scale. The effect is immediate but subtle. Patterns that were invisible in isolation begin to appear when layered. Not confirmations, but alignments. Repeated intersections across independent categories that begin to reduce the field of plausible explanations. And within that tightening field, one profile continues to persist longer than others. Still not named in conclusion. Still not isolated as definitive, but increasingly difficult to separate from the structure of the case itself. As 1995 approaches, the investigation reaches a stage where it is no longer expanding knowledge outward, but compressing uncertainty inward. The river has already given everything it will give in physical terms. What remains is interpretation. And interpretation, under pressure, begins to converge. Slowly, relentlessly, towards something that has always been present in the background of the case, but never fully exposed to its center. Something still waiting to be seen clearly enough to become irreversible. By 1996, the case has stopped feeling like a pursuit and started feeling like a containment problem. How to hold together thousands of fragments of time, testimony, and terrain without letting the entire structure collapse under its own weight. The Green River investigation is no longer just active. It is saturated. Every surface of it has been examined, re-examined, and still the center refuses to reveal itself. Inside the task force, the tone has shifted again, not toward optimism, not toward despair, but toward precision under constraint. The work is less about discovering new information and more about eliminating everything that cannot survive repeated verification. It is a process of attrition against uncertainty. And still, the river gives no relief. Another recovery, another identification, another life restored only in paperwork. The pattern remains unchanged in its emotional impact, even as it becomes statistically routine. Each case is a reminder that the timeline of violence has never stopped, only slowed and scattered across years. But something else is happening beneath the surface of the investigation, something quieter than new bodies, but more structurally important. The system is finally beginning to talk to itself. For years, the case files had existed as parallel tracks, behavioral analysis in one corridor, forensic data in another, geographic profiling in another still. Each department produced insight but rarely alignment. Now, with improved integration, those isolated streams begin to merge into a single analytical flow. And when they merge, they begin to narrow. Patterns that once appeared diffuse start to compress, not into certainty, but into proximity. The geometry of the case tightens. Industrial zones remain consistent anchors. Highway corridors still dominate movement analysis. Victim locations still cluster in predictable but emotionally disturbing configurations. Places where visibility is low and transience is high. The killer has never needed complexity. He has relied on repetition within anonymity. That realization becomes the foundation of a new investigative focus. Not who stands out, but who never does. Not deviation, but consistency. Not anomaly, but persistence. In that reframed logic, suspect evaluation undergoes a quiet but profound shift. The emphasis moves away from dramatic red flags and toward long-term behavioral stability, employment continuity, geographic embedding, social invisibility that is not absence but integration. And within that framework, certain historical suspects, once dismissed, once deprioritized, begin to reappear in consolidated data reviews. Not because anything about them has changed, but because the model of understanding has. One individual in particular continues to surface across multiple layers of analysis, not in isolation, but in overlap. Employment records tied to industrial logistics. Residence history that aligns with known operational corridors. Prior interviews that, while unremarkable at the time, now sit uncomfortably close to established behavioral parameters. Still, nothing is definitive, but the accumulation is no longer ignorable. Investigators do not move on instinct. They move on thresholds, and thresholds are beginning to compress. At the same time, forensic science continues its slow but consequential advance. Evidence previously considered exhausted is reintroduced into testing cycles with improved sensitivity. The process is repetitive, almost monotonous, but it carries a different weight now, because each iteration has a higher chance of producing something previously invisible. And occasionally it does. Not dramatic revelations, not confessions in physical form, but traces, partial indicators, subtle confirmations that certain items belong to certain timelines more firmly than before. Each result tightens the perimeter again. Each tightening reduces the space in which the unknown can exist without contradiction. Outside the investigative structure, the public narrative has largely stabilized. The Green River case is no longer front-page urgency, but institutional memory, a symbol of scale, persistence, and investigative evolution. Yet for families, there is no such stabilization. Time has not reduced the weight of absence. It only changes its texture. Inside the task force, a new phase begins quietly, consolidation under pressure. All historical suspect data is revisited once more, but this time with unified cross-referencing across all disciplines. Behavioral profiles are compared directly against geographic movement data. Employment history is mapped against victim timelines. Witness descriptions are weighted not individually, but collectively. The result is not clarity, but convergence. Certain profiles begin to consistently survive elimination across multiple categories, not because they are proven, but because they are consistently compatible with the total structure of the case. And in an investigation this large, compatibility becomes meaningful. One name begins to persist across this converging system with increasing resistance to dismissal. It does not emerge as a sudden revelation. It emerges as a residual presence, something that remains after everything else has been filtered out. Still, investigators are careful, because proximity is not guilt. And this case has punished premature certainty too many times to repeat the pattern. So the name remains within the system, but not at its center. Yet the direction of movement is no longer ambiguous. The investigation is converging. Slowly, methodically, irreversibly. Then comes a shift that does not originate from evidence alone, but from synthesis. A comprehensive behavioral geographic model is constructed to simulate offender movement patterns over time, not to identify a name, but to test consistency across known variables. When the model is run against historical data, something begins to stabilize. Certain patterns repeat with unusual fidelity. Certain profiles align with more variables than others. And while no single result is declared definitive, the distribution of probability begins to skew. Not dramatically, but persistently. And in a case defined by uncertainty, persistence is its own kind of signal. As the mid-1990s close, the investigation enters a state that can no longer be described as exploratory. It is now evaluative. Everything is measured against everything else. Every inconsistency is weighted. Every alignment is recorded. And in that environment, the unknown begins to shrink. Not because it has been solved, but because fewer explanations can survive contact with the totality of data. And somewhere within that shrinking space, the outline of something once dismissed as background noise begins to take on structure. Not yet a conclusion, not yet a name spoken with certainty, but something increasingly difficult to explain away. The river continues to flow. But for the first time in years, it no longer feels like it is hiding everything. It feels like it is narrowing towards something that was always there, just not yet fully seen. By the late 1990s, the Green River investigation has entered a phase where silence is no longer absence. It is data. Every gap in activity, every period without new discoveries, is no longer interpreted as calm, but as structure. The case has become too large to move randomly. Every stillness now carries implication. Inside the task force, the atmosphere has hardened into disciplined compression. There are fewer conversations about possibilities, more about constraints, fewer speculative leaps, more controlled revalidation. The work is no longer driven by discovery alone, but by the necessity of eliminating contradiction across decades of accumulated evidence. And still, the river does not change its language. It only changes where it is heard. Another set of remains is processed, another identity confirmed, another life placed into the record with clinical precision and emotional weight that no procedure can neutralize. Each confirmation feels smaller in scale than the earlier years, but heavier in implication. The violence has not stopped. It has only become more dispersed, more isolated, more difficult to immediately connect. But within the investigation, the more significant shift is not in new cases. It is in reinterpretation of old ones. The entire archive is now being treated as a single system rather than a sequence of events. Every prior assumption is reevaluated under unified modeling. Behavioral analysis, geographic profiling, forensic timelines, all recalculated against a consolidated structure. And when the system is unified, something long obscured begins to appear. Repetition across layers that were never previously aligned. Victim locations that correspond not just geographically, but operationally. Time windows that align not only with individual cases, but with broader patterns of offender availability. The killer is no longer being tracked as a series of incidents. He is being reconstructed as a continuous operational presence. That distinction changes the investigative posture, because continuity implies stability, and stability implies integration into everyday systems. Attention narrows further toward environments that allow long-term invisibility without disruption: logistics corridors, transit labor sectors, mobile work structures where identity is secondary to function. The killer is increasingly understood not as someone outside society, but embedded within it in a way that avoids scrutiny by design. In that reframing, suspect evaluation becomes more severe and more subtle at the same time. The most suspicious individuals are no longer those who behave unusually. They are those who behave consistently across long periods without meaningful deviation. In that category, certain historical subjects re-emerge from the archive, not because they were ignored, but because earlier investigative frameworks could not fully contextualize their patterns. Now, within a unified model, those same patterns gain new interpretive weight. One individual continues to surface repeatedly across unrelated data sets: employment history tied to mobile or industrial environments, geographic presence within operational corridors, prior investigative contact that never escalated into formal charges. Each element alone is insufficient. Together, they resist clean dismissal. Still, investigators do not rush toward conclusion, because the history of the case has punished acceleration, and every premature certainty has cost years. So the process remains controlled, analytical, sequential, but the direction of movement is no longer unclear. Convergence is no longer theoretical, is observable. At the same time, forensic science continues its incremental transformation of the archive. Evidence once considered exhausted is periodically reintroduced into improved testing cycles. Each iteration refines what can be confirmed, what can be excluded, and what remains unresolved. The results do not deliver sudden breakthroughs. They deliver tightening boundaries. And boundaries, over time, reshape the possible. Parallel to this, behavioral reconstruction reaches a new level of abstraction. The offender is no longer modeled as a person acting within a timeline, but as a system operating within constraints of mobility, anonymity, and opportunity. Investigators begin to understand that the killer's strength has never been speed or improvisation. It has been predictability masked as normalcy. That insight reframes decades of uncertainty, because it suggests the killer was never hidden in chaos. He was hidden in routine. As the investigation approaches the turn of the millennium, the cumulative effect of unified analysis begins to produce something unprecedented in the case history. Not identification, but narrowing precision. Certain geographic zones appear repeatedly across victimology and suspect modeling. Certain timeframes cluster with statistical consistency. Certain behavioral patterns persist across multiple independent reconstructions. And within that increasingly narrow field, the same residual profile continues to survive analytical elimination. Still not isolated as definitive. Still not elevated to certainty, but increasingly difficult to displace. The investigation has reached a point where absence of proof no longer implies absence of structure. It implies incomplete visibility. And incomplete visibility, under sustained analytical pressure, tends to collapse inward rather than expand outward. Outside the task force, the Green River case has become institutionalized in criminal justice history. It is studied as a benchmark for serial offender complexity, investigative endurance, and systemic limitation. But inside the system, there is no academic distance. There is only accumulation of data, of pressure, of unresolved alignment. Then comes a critical shift in synthesis. Cross-disciplinary integration reaches full operational maturity. Behavioral models are no longer separate from geographic mapping or forensic timelines. They are layered into a single interpretive framework capable of running iterative convergence tests across decades of data. When applied, the system does not produce a name. It produces a narrowing corridor of probability, a zone where multiple independent variables begin to overlap with increasing frequency, a zone where certain profiles no longer stand apart from the case structure, but sit inside it. And within that zone, one presence becomes increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence. Not because it is proven, but because it is consistently compatible with too many independent systems of analysis. As the decade closes, the investigation is no longer expanding outward into new territory. It is contracting inward toward resolution. Slowly, methodically, and with a sense of inevitability that does not yet allow itself to be spoken aloud. The river continues to flow through the city, but the investigation is no longer following the river. It is following everything the river has been pointing toward all along. By the early 2000s, the Green River investigation has reached a stage where time itself is no longer just a backdrop. It is evidence. Every year added to the case compresses older assumptions, reshapes earlier interpretations, and forces the archive to behave like a living system under continuous recalibration. Inside the task force, the language has changed again. Fewer words about pursuit, more about verification integrity. The central question is no longer what was missed, but what remains consistent across decades of inconsistent data. The investigation has become less about chasing a moving target and more about stabilizing a collapsing map. And still, the river continues to yield fragments of the past. Cold case re-examinations produce new confirmations. Advances in forensic science allow materials once considered exhausted to be reprocessed with greater sensitivity. Each result is small in isolation, too small to be decisive, but collectively they begin to reinforce a tightening structure of interpretation. Victims are no longer viewed as isolated cases. They are nodes in a long, continuous pattern of selection. And that pattern is no longer abstract. It is measurable. Geographic clustering, once debated, now persists under multiple analytical models. Highway, corridors, industrial zones, transitional environments. These are not just locations anymore. They are operational constants. The killer's movement is increasingly understood not as erratic travel, but as structured navigation through predictable environments that minimize exposure. This realization forces another shift in investigative thinking. The focus is no longer solely on identity. It is on embedded functionality. What kind of life allows repeated movement through these systems without generating detectable disruption? What kind of occupation normalizes absence, irregular hours, and geographic dispersion? The suspect universe narrows again, but not towards certainty, toward compatibility. Certain individuals persist across multiple investigative layers: employment history, geographic presence, prior interviews, behavioral modeling outputs. Not because they dominate any single category, but because they survive across all of them without contradiction. One profile, in particular, continues to reappear across these overlapping systems. Not elevated as a conclusion, but increasingly resistant to removal. Still, the investigative culture remains cautious. The history of the case has enforced a discipline of restraint. Too many earlier leads appeared promising before dissolving under scrutiny. The task force has learned that convergence is not confirmation. It is only compression. So the work continues in structured cycles: reanalysis, cross-validation, elimination of inconsistencies, refinement of overlap zones. And with each cycle, the margins tighten. Parallel to this, forensic review reaches a new level of sensitivity. Evidence collected decades earlier is subjected to updated methodologies that allow for detection of traces previously invisible. The process does not produce revelations in isolation, but it accumulates subtle confirmations that reinforce the temporal and geographic coherence of certain case clusters. Nothing definitive emerges, but the space for randomness shrinks. At the same time, behavioral reconstruction has matured into a highly integrated model. The offender is now understood less as an individual with unpredictable impulses and more as a system operating within stable constraints of opportunity, mobility, and concealment. Violence is no longer seen as deviation from normal life, but as an episodic function within it. That reframing is critical, because it explains how long-term continuity was possible without detection. The killer did not exist outside structure. He moved within it so effectively that structure never registered him as an anomaly. As the early 2000s progress, the investigation becomes increasingly reliant on synthesis rather than discovery. New leads are rare. Most progress comes from reinterpretation of existing material under unified models that integrate behavioral, geographic, and forensic datasets into a single analytical framework. When that framework is applied, something begins to stabilize across multiple iterations. Not a name, not a direct identification, but a persistent convergence zone, a bounded region of probability where multiple independent systems repeatedly overlap. Within that zone, certain profiles consistently reappear, not as outliers, but as survivors of elimination across every major analytical filter. One in particular continues to persist with unusual resilience, still not isolated as definitive, still not declared central, but increasingly difficult to displace without introducing contradiction elsewhere in the system. Outside the task force, the case has entered a different phase of cultural memory. It is no longer immediate public crisis, but institutional reference point. It shapes training, methodology, and investigative doctrine for serial crime analysis. Yet for those still inside the case structure, there is no abstraction. There is only accumulation without closure. Then comes a development that does not alter the evidence directly, but alters how it is organized. A full-scale consolidation of all historical data into a unified analytical environment reaches operational completion. For the first time, every known component of the investigation, victim records, suspect histories, forensic results, geographic mapping, behavioral profiles, is accessible within a single integrated system. The effect is not dramatic in appearance, but it is profound in function. Because once unified, the system begins to reveal relational patterns that were previously invisible due to fragmentation. Cross-category alignments become more frequent. Temporal correlations become more precise. Geographic clustering becomes more consistent. And within this integrated structure, the same residual profiles continue to persist. Still not resolved. Still not confirmed. But increasingly bound within a narrowing analytical corridor. By the end of this phase, the investigation is no longer defined by what is unknown. It is defined by how little of the unknown can still survive unified scrutiny. And that remaining space, small, compressed, persistent, is where the case now resides. Not solved, not finished, but no longer expanding, only tightening, towards something that has been present all along, waiting not for discovery in fragments, but for recognition as a whole. By the mid-2000s, the Green River case no longer behaves like an open investigation in the traditional sense. It functions instead as a stabilized evidentiary system, one that is continuously maintained, periodically reprocessed, and permanently unresolved. The violence that defined its origin is no longer the only focus. The architecture of understanding has become equally important. Inside the investigative unit, the work has shifted into a different register. Fewer active leads, more structural audits. The question is no longer what new information exists, but whether existing information can finally be made to align without contradiction. The case is no longer expanding outward into uncertainty. It is compressing inward toward interpretive limits. And still, the river remains unchanged in its symbolism. Not because it continues to produce answers, but because it continues to preserve absence. Cold case reviews intensify with renewed methodological rigor. Advances in forensic science allow previously marginal evidence to be revisited under significantly improved sensitivity thresholds. Items once dismissed as inconclusive are reclassified as partial contributors to a larger pattern. Each result is small, but together they begin to reinforce a structure that was never visible in earlier decades. Victim distribution is no longer interpreted as scattered tragedy. It is increasingly modeled as consistent selection within defined environmental parameters. The same categories of location continue to appear: industrial peripheries, highway-adjacent corridors, transient zones where visibility is inherently unstable and oversight naturally fragmented. The conclusion emerging from repeated analysis is not about randomness. It is about predictability within concealment. The killer did not avoid patterns. He relied on them. This reframing pushes the investigation further away from traditional profiling and deeper into systemic reconstruction. Attention focuses less on personality traits and more on operational conditions. What kind of life structure can sustain long-term movement through multiple jurisdictions, irregular schedules, and environments where identity is rarely verified? The suspect field narrows accordingly. Individuals previously considered peripheral now reappear within integrated models, not because new evidence has surfaced, but because system-level analysis has changed how absence is interpreted. One profile continues to demonstrate persistent overlap across multiple independent datasets: employment continuity within mobile or logistics-adjacent environments, geographic presence aligning with known operational corridors, and historical investigative contact that never progressed into formal resolution. Still, there is no singular point of confirmation. Only sustained compatibility across systems that were never originally designed to converge. Investigators remain cautious. The institutional memory of the case enforces restraint. Every apparent convergence in the past has required later correction. Premature certainty has repeatedly led to extended misdirection. So the process remains methodical. Verification cycles, cross-model comparison, elimination of contradictions, recalibration of probability. And yet, with each iteration, the same structural outcome repeats. The unknown area of the case shrinks. Not suddenly, but persistently. Parallel to this, forensic science continues its incremental transformation of the archive. Evidence that has survived decades of storage is reintroduced into analysis pipelines with enhanced detection capability. These processes do not yield dramatic breakthroughs, but they refine the boundaries of what can and cannot be excluded. And in a case defined by accumulation, exclusion becomes its own form of progress. Behavioral reconstruction reaches its most integrated stage yet. The offender is now modeled as a system of repeated behavioral cycles operating within stable environmental constraints. Violence is not treated as disruption, but as periodic activation within an otherwise continuous existence. This model resolves one of the case's long-standing contradictions: how sustained normalcy could coexist with repeated extreme violence over decades without external detection. The answer is not separation from society. It is seamless integration into its blind spots. As the mid-2000s progress, investigative synthesis becomes the dominant mode of analysis. All historical data, no matter how fragmented or outdated, is continuously reevaluated under unified frameworks that integrate behavioral, geographic, and forensic dimensions. When these frameworks are applied at scale, a consistent pattern emerges. Certain geographic and temporal clusters remain stable across independent modeling systems. Certain suspect profiles continue to survive elimination across multiple analytical layers, not because they are proven, but because they remain compatible with an increasingly constrained set of explanations. And among them, one profile continues to persist with unusual durability. Not isolated, not confirmed, but increasingly difficult to remove without creating inconsistencies elsewhere in the structure. Outside the task force, the case has taken on a different kind of permanence. It is no longer an active public emergency. It is a foundational case study in investigative limitation and methodological evolution. It informs training, research, and procedural standards for serial offender analysis across jurisdictions. But within the system itself, there is no distance from it, only continuity. Then comes a development that changes not the facts, but the way facts can be seen. A fully unified analytical environment is now standard across all case components. For the first time, every available dataset, historical interviews, forensic records, geographic mapping, behavioral modeling outputs, is fully interoperable in real time. This does not produce immediate answers, but it eliminates structural fragmentation. And in doing so, it reveals something critical. Not new evidence, but consistent alignment patterns that persist across independently generated analyses. Temporal correlations tighten. Geographic clustering stabilizes. Behavioral compatibility becomes more consistently distributed within a narrowing subset of profiles. And within that subset, the same residual presence continues to appear. Still not elevated, still not concluded, but increasingly central to the structure that remains after everything else has been filtered away. By this stage, the investigation is no longer defined by pursuit. It is defined by compression. And compression, sustained long enough, begins to resemble direction. Not towards certainty yet, but towards something that can no longer be explained away as coincidence. Something that has remained stable through decades of scrutiny, waiting at the center of everything that has been narrowed around it. By the late 2000s, the Green River investigation is no longer expanding in any direction that resembles discovery. It has become a sealed analytical environment, constantly revisited, continuously refined, and structurally incapable of producing anything except tighter approximations of an already defined unknown. The case is not moving forward in the traditional sense. It is converging inward under the weight of everything already known. Inside the investigative structure, the tone is almost clinical now. Emotion has long since been replaced by procedural discipline. The work is measured in alignments, contradictions, and eliminations. Every cycle of review is less about finding something new and more about testing whether anything previously assumed can still survive contact with unified analysis. And still, the river remains unchanged in its symbolic role. Not as a source of answers, but as a constant reference point for everything the investigation has failed to resolve. Cold case reviews continue with increasingly sophisticated tools. Forensic reprocessing reaches levels of sensitivity unimaginable in the early years of the investigation. Evidence that once produced no usable results is now capable of yielding partial confirmations, small fragments of temporal, geographic, or material consistency that reinforce long-term structural patterns. Each fragment is minor, but the accumulation is decisive in its effect. Victimology is now fully integrated into a single longitudinal model. The victims are no longer interpreted as isolated incidents across time. They are understood as part of a continuous selection system operating within a defined set of environmental conditions. Those conditions remain consistent. Zones of transience, industrial peripheries, highway-adjacent corridors, spaces where individuals can appear and disappear without sustained institutional tracking. The killer's methodology as it is now reconstructed, is not random and not chaotic. It is optimized for invisibility within structured neglect. That realization has reshaped every layer of analysis. The focus of the investigation is no longer on identifying dramatic behavioral anomalies. It is on identifying sustained normalcy within systems that inherently obscure individual continuity. That shift has profound consequences. It eliminates many suspects who once appeared plausible under older frameworks. And it preserves a smaller set of individuals who persist across multiple independent systems of evaluation without contradiction. One profile, in particular, continues to withstand repeated elimination attempts across behavioral, geographic, and historical layers. Not because it produces overt evidence, but because it remains structurally compatible with an unusually large number of independent constraints. Still, investigators do not elevate it beyond its evidentiary status, because compatibility is not proof. And this case has been defined for decades by the danger of mistaking alignment for confirmation. So the process remains disciplined, iterative validation, cross-model comparison, contradiction filtering, probabilistic refinement. And yet, with each iteration, the same phenomenon repeats. The space of uncertainty continues to shrink, not in sudden leaps, but in controlled, irreversible compression. Parallel to this, forensic science continues to tighten the boundaries of what can be definitively excluded. Materials recovered decades earlier are re-examined under advanced methodologies, producing incremental improvements in resolution. These improvements do not generate final answers, but they reduce ambiguity in ways that subtly reshape the structure of interpretation. Each reduction in ambiguity is a narrowing of possible explanations. Each narrowing is a step away from randomness. Behavioral reconstruction has now reached its most integrated form. The offender is modeled as operating within a stable framework of environmental access, mobility, and concealment. Violence is no longer treated as episodic deviation from normal life, but as a recurring function embedded within it. This model resolves a long-standing investigative contradiction: how sustained public invisibility could coexist with repeated acts of extreme violence over decades. The resolution is not separation from society. It is seamless absorption into its blind zones. As a late 2000s progress, the investigation becomes almost entirely synthetic. New leads are rare. Most progress comes from reprocessing existing data through increasingly unified analytical systems. Behavioral, geographic, and forensic layers are no longer separate disciplines. They function as a single interpretive framework. And when that framework is applied at full scale, something consistent emerges. Certain geographic clusters remain stable across all models. Certain temporal patterns persist under repeated recalibration. Certain suspect profiles continue to survive elimination across multiple independent analytical dimensions. Not because they are confirmed, but because they cannot be removed without destabilizing the structure that contains them. And among those residual profiles, one continues to persist with unusual resilience. Not isolated, not elevated, but increasingly central to the smallest remaining zone of uncertainty. Outside the task force, the case has become institutionalized as a reference point in criminal investigative methodology. It is studied for its complexity, its duration, and its resistance to early resolution. It is used to train new generations of investigators in the limits of pattern recognition under conditions of incomplete data. But within the investigation itself, there is no abstraction, only accumulation. Then comes a structural shift that does not alter the evidence, but alters its visibility. A fully unified analytical environment now integrates all historical datasets into a single, continuously updating system. Every fragment of the case, no matter how old or incomplete, is now accessible in real time across all analytical dimensions. This does not produce revelation. It produces convergence under constraint. Because once fully unified, the system no longer allows isolated interpretation. Every new analysis must reconcile with every existing dataset simultaneously. And under those conditions, the structure begins to stabilize in a way it never has before. Patterns that were once fragmented now align across independent systems. Geographic clusters reinforce temporal clusters. Behavioral models reinforce forensic constraints. And within this reinforced structure, the same residual presence continues to appear. Still not declared definitive. Still not isolated as conclusion. But increasingly difficult to displace without creating contradiction elsewhere in the system. By the end of this phase, the investigation is no longer defined by what remains unknown. It is defined by how little of that unknown can still survive unified scrutiny without collapsing into explanation. And in that collapsing space, compressed by decades of analysis, refinement, and elimination, the case continues to move, not outward into discovery, but inward towards something that has been present the entire time. Waiting not for discovery, but for final recognition under pressure that can no longer be resisted. By the early 2010s, the Green River case is no longer an active pursuit in the conventional sense. It is a closed loop of accumulated intelligence, periodically reactivated not to search, but to confirm whether anything within it still resists explanation. The investigation has aged into a structure of controlled re-examination, where every new pass through the data is less about discovery and more about final validation of what has already been narrowed down over decades. Inside the investigative system, the atmosphere is quiet, almost austere. The urgency of earlier years has been replaced by procedural inevitability. The work is no longer driven by the expectation of surprise. It is driven by the need to ensure that no remaining uncertainty is an artifact of fragmentation, oversight, or technological limitation. And still, the river remains unchanged in its symbolic weight. Not as a source of new victims, but as a historical boundary marker of everything the investigation has absorbed and could not resolve in real time. Cold case science, now at its most advanced stage, continues to revisit the oldest evidence with precision tools that did not exist when the first bodies were recovered. Each reanalysis is smaller in scope than the last, but more refined in output. The goal is no longer broad discovery. It is micro-level validation of existing structural interpretations. And with each cycle, the same result repeats. Not revelation, but reinforcement. Victimology, now fully digitized and integrated across multiple analytical frameworks, is treated as a single continuous system rather than a chronological sequence of crimes. The distribution of victims remains consistent across all models. Environments of transience, zones of low surveillance, corridors where human movement is constant but personal continuity is weak. The conclusion is no longer speculative. It is structurally embedded in the dataset. The offender's operational logic is now understood with near-complete clarity at the systemic level. He did not rely on unpredictability. He relied on environments that naturally erased predictability in others. The system itself provided concealment, not through absence of witnesses, but through absence of retention. That understanding reframes the entire investigative history, because it explains not only how the crimes occurred, but why they remained structurally resistant to early detection. Attention within the task force is now almost entirely focused on final convergence modeling. Every remaining suspect profile is tested against the full integrated dataset, behavioral patterns, geographic alignment, temporal availability, forensic compatibility. The system does not search broadly anymore. It evaluates survivability under total constraint. Most profiles fail quickly. Some persist briefly before collapsing under cross-variable contradiction. But one continues to endure repeated cycles of elimination without fully breaking. Not because it provides affirmative proof, but because it continues to satisfy too many independent constraints simultaneously to be dismissed without introducing inconsistency elsewhere in the system. This is no longer treated as suspicion in the traditional sense. It is treated as structural persistence. And structural persistence in a closed analytical system becomes increasingly significant. Still, investigators remain disciplined in their interpretation. The institutional memory of the case has made one principle absolute. Convergence is not confirmation. Every apparent narrowing must survive scrutiny across all layers before it can be elevated to conclusion. So the system continues to run. Iteration after iteration. Reduction after reduction. Until the remaining uncertainty exists only in a tightly bounded space that no longer expands under any tested model. Parallel to this, forensic integration reaches its final stage of maturity. Every available piece of physical evidence is now indexed, digitized, and cross-referenced within a unified analytical environment. The effect is not dramatic, but absolute. There is no longer any isolated data. Every fragment exists in relation to every other fragment. And within that relational structure, the same patterns continue to hold. No contradictions emerge that can reopen the case. No alternative model successfully replaces the existing convergence framework without introducing greater instability. Behavioral reconstruction, now fully stabilized, confirms what years of incremental modeling have suggested. The offender operated not outside of social systems, but inside their blind architecture, moving through environments where identity is functionally untracked, where repetition does not register as anomaly, and where long-term continuity can exist without formal recognition. That is the final systemic explanation for decades of invisibility. Not evasion, but structural invisibility. As the investigation reaches its most refined state, the remaining uncertainty is no longer wide or diffuse. It is compressed into a single residual zone defined by persistent compatibility across all analytical dimensions. Within that zone, the same profile continues to remain. Not isolated as definitive, not declared as final conclusion, but no longer removable without breaking the internal consistency of the system that has been built around it. And that is where the case ultimately settles. Not in revelation, not in sudden resolution, but in convergence so sustained that absence of formal declaration no longer weakens its structural weight. The river, after decades of silence, is no longer the center of mystery. It has become the perimeter of something finally understood in shape, if not yet spoken as certainty. And somewhere within that narrowed space of interpretation, the investigation rests, not finished in language, but completed in structure, waiting only for the final alignment that turns compression into closure. By the early 2010s, the Green River case no longer behaves like an investigation still searching for answers. It behaves like a system that has already found its structure and is now waiting for formal confirmation to catch up with analytical reality. The work inside the unit is minimal in motion, but extreme in precision. Every dataset is stable, every variable accounted for, every remaining uncertainty reduced to a narrow band of statistical persistence. The river itself no longer functions as a source of discovery. It functions as historical imprint, a fixed reference point marking the beginning of an investigative era defined by scale, delay, and eventual convergence. Cold case operations now operate in maintenance mode. Evidence review is no longer exploratory. It is confirmatory. Advanced forensic methods are applied not to reveal unknowns, but to validate whether any previously unseen contradiction still exists within the reconstructive framework. Each cycle returns the same outcome: tighter coherence, fewer ambiguities, no structural breaks. Victimology is fully integrated into a single continuous model. The pattern is no longer debated. It is embedded. Locations, timelines, and environmental conditions remain consistent across decades of analysis. Industrial peripheries, transient corridors, highway-adjacent zones. These are not simply recurring themes. They are defining constraints of the offender's operational environment. The understanding has shifted from where did it happen to where could it have consistently remained undetected. That shift completes a fundamental reframing of the case, because it explains the core paradox that defined the investigation for decades: how a single offender could maintain continuity of activity over such an extended period without structural exposure. The answer, now fully accepted within the analytical framework, is not mobility alone. It is systemic invisibility embedded within predictable human movement patterns. Inside the investigative structure, final convergence modeling reaches full operational maturity. Every remaining suspect profile is evaluated across the complete integrated dataset: behavioral reconstruction, geographic alignment, temporal correlation, forensic compatibility, and historical investigative interaction. Most profiles collapse quickly under full system evaluation. A few persist for longer, sustained by partial alignment in one domain but contradiction in others. And then there is the residual profile, the one that continues to survive not through dominance in any single category, but through persistent compatibility across all categories simultaneously. It does not produce definitive proof. It produces continuity. And in a fully integrated system, continuity is not neutral. It is structurally meaningful. Still, institutional discipline holds. No conclusion is permitted without final validation. Every convergence must be tested against the possibility of systemic bias, modeling artifacts, or residual data fragmentation. The history of the case enforces caution as doctrine. So the system continues to run. Iteration after iteration. Compression after compression. Until the unknown space becomes so narrow that it no longer behaves like uncertainty. It behaves like a single unresolved node within an otherwise stable structure. Parallel to this, forensic science reaches its final evaluative phase. All recoverable evidence has been digitized, cross-referenced, and reprocessed under the most advanced methodologies available. Nothing remains unexamined. What persists is not mystery in the traditional sense, but limitation, boundaries of what evidence can still conclusively distinguish. And those boundaries no longer expand. They stabilize. Behavioral reconstruction, now fully integrated with geographic and forensic modeling, confirms a final systemic interpretation. The offender was not defined by deviation from ordinary life, but by seamless integration into environments that naturally suppress long-term recognition. The crime pattern was not hidden through complexity, but through consistency within overlooked systems. That realization closes one of the last conceptual gaps in the case. Not by naming an individual, but by defining the mechanism that made long-term invisibility structurally possible. As the investigation enters its final analytical stage, the remaining uncertainty is no longer distributed across multiple unknowns. It is concentrated into a single residual zone defined by cross-system compatibility. Within that zone, the same profile continues to persist across all evaluative frameworks. Not as confirmed identity, but as the only remaining structure that survives full system contradiction testing without collapse. At this point, the investigation is no longer expanding knowledge. It is testing whether anything still exists that can invalidate what has already converged. And nothing does. Outside the task force, the case has fully transitioned into institutional legacy. It is studied not as an ongoing mystery, but as a completed analytical evolution that demonstrates how long-term serial investigations mature under technological and methodological advancement. It is no longer defined by urgency. It is defined by structure. But within the system itself, closure has not yet been formally declared. Because formal declaration requires one final condition, irreducibility. And the remaining convergence has not yet been expressed in that final form. Still, nothing in the system contradicts it. Nothing displaces it. Nothing replaces it. And so the case rests in its final state of compression, no longer moving toward discovery, but waiting for the moment when accumulated structure becomes irreversible conclusion. The river continues to flow through the city as it always has. But beneath its surface, the investigation no longer searches. It waits only for the final recognition of what decades of convergence have already made unavoidable. By the mid-2010s, the Green River investigation has reached a condition that no longer resembles active pursuit or even cold case inquiry. It functions as a fully stabilized analytical construct, continuously preserved, periodically stress-tested, and structurally complete in every measurable dimension except formal closure. The case no longer generates uncertainty through lack of data. It generates pressure through excessive convergence without final articulation. Inside the investigative framework, operations are minimal but exacting. Every review cycle is essentially a confirmation pass, revalidating that no new contradiction has emerged, no overlooked variable has destabilized the existing structure, no residual fragment of data undermines the system's coherence. The work is not exploratory. It is maintenance of resolution without declaration. And still, the river remains unchanged in its symbolic function, not as an origin of mystery, but as the environmental constant against which decades of investigative evolution have been measured. Cold case systems now treat the entire archive as a unified closed dataset. Forensic science no longer approaches the evidence as scattered artifacts, but as interdependent components of a single reconstructed historical sequence. Every object, every trace, every recovered fragment exists within a relational map that has been refined over years into near-total internal consistency. Each new validation cycle produces the same outcome. No structural contradictions. No emerging anomalies. No alternative explanatory model capable of sustaining full system compatibility. Victimology, now fully embedded within this unified framework, is no longer debated in terms of individual circumstances. It is understood as a consistent output of environmental selection dynamics operating across time. The locations, conditions, and temporal patterns of the crimes remain stable under every major analytical iteration. The offender's operational environment is now fully defined at the systemic level, not by personality, but by structure. Spaces of transience, zones of fragmented oversight, infrastructure designed for movement rather than retention, a landscape in which continuity of observation is inherently broken. This understanding completes a long-standing analytical transition, from searching for a hidden individual to modeling a hidden operational context. Inside this fully integrated system, final convergence modeling continues to cycle through residual suspect profiles. Each is tested against the totality of reconstructed data, behavioral consistency, geographic alignment, temporal availability, forensic compatibility, and historical investigative interaction. Most profiles collapse quickly under multivariable stress testing. A few persist partially, surviving in isolated dimensions before failing in others. And then there is the remaining residual structure. It does not dominate any single category. It does not produce decisive forensic linkage. It does not offer direct evidentiary confirmation. But it persists across all categories without introducing contradiction. That persistence has become the central analytical feature of the final phase of the investigation. Not proof, not accusation, but structural survivability under full system constraint. Even so, the institutional framework maintains its discipline. No conclusion is permitted based solely on convergence behavior. Every remaining candidate structure must be evaluated against the possibility of systemic bias, historical data distortion, or modeling artifacts introduced by decades of iterative refinement. So the system continues to operate under control conditions. Recalibration, cross-validation, contradiction filtering. Again and again, until the residual uncertainty no longer behaves like a field of unknowns, but like a single compressed node within an otherwise fully stabilized system. At the same time, forensic science reaches the outer limit of its contribution to the case. All recoverable physical evidence has been processed, reprocessed, digitized, and integrated into unified analytical infrastructure. What remains is not lack of effort or technology, but limitation in what physical remnants can still distinguish with absolute certainty after decades of degradation and context loss. And yet, despite these limits, no alternative explanatory structure emerges that can replace the existing convergence model without generating internal inconsistency. Behavioral reconstruction, now fully synchronized with geographic and forensic modeling, reinforces the final systemic interpretation. The offender's long-term invisibility was not the result of isolation from society, but the result of complete integration into its least traceable operational layers. The pattern was sustained not through concealment in darkness, but through presence within systems that naturally erase continuity. That realization finalizes the explanatory architecture of the case, not by identifying the individual, but by fully defining the mechanism that allowed the pattern to persist. As the mid-2010s progress, the investigation reaches a state where uncertainty is no longer distributed. It is localized, concentrated, reduced to a single residual structure that survives all analytical stress testing without collapse. Within that structure, the same profile continues to appear across all integrated systems, not as confirmed identity, but as the only remaining configuration that does not contradict the total reconstructed reality. At this stage, the investigation is no longer expanding toward answers. It is evaluating whether any remaining uncertainty can still be justified within a fully coherent system. And increasingly, it cannot. Outside the task force, the case has fully transitioned into institutional legacy status. It is no longer treated as unresolved in the practical sense. It is treated as structurally complete but formally unfinalized, a case study in how convergence accumulates under long-term investigative pressure across evolving methodologies. But within the system itself, closure remains deliberately withheld, because closure requires final articulation. And final articulation requires irreducibility beyond convergence. That last step has not yet been formally executed. Still, nothing in the system resists it. Nothing contradicts it. Nothing displaces it. And so the case continues in its final state of controlled compression, no longer searching, no longer expanding, but maintaining a singular unresolved point of formal designation that has already been shaped by decades of structural convergence. The river continues to flow, but the investigation has already reached everything it was structurally capable of reaching. And what remains is no longer discovery. It is acknowledgement waiting to be spoken aloud in irreversible form. By the time the system reaches its final phase of internal convergence, the investigation no longer behaves like a search. It behaves like a closed circuit under load, every variable already accounted for, every alternative pathway already tested, every contradiction either resolved or structurally eliminated. What remains is not uncertainty in the traditional sense, but a single unresolved point that persists not because it is unknown, but because it has not yet been formally acknowledged. Inside the investigative framework, This moment does not arrive with noise. It arrives with administrative precision. A final cross-system evaluation is initiated. All major analytical layers, behavioral reconstruction, geographic modeling, forensic correlation, historical interview synthesis, and temporal pattern alignment, are run in synchronized iteration across the full dataset. Not separately, not sequentially, but simultaneously under unified constraint conditions that allow no isolated interpretation. The result is not immediate revelation. It is convergence under compression. Across every independent model, one residual structure continues to persist, not strengthened by assumption, not elevated by interpretation, but surviving elimination across all systems without generating contradiction elsewhere in the dataset. That persistence becomes the decisive factor. Because in a fully integrated system, what cannot be removed without destabilizing coherence begins to acquire operational weight. The investigative language shifts accordingly, not toward accusation, not yet toward closure, but toward activation. A subject profile that has appeared repeatedly across years of analytical refinement is now subjected to full-spectrum revalidation, not in isolation, but in total system context. Every historical reference is re-examined, every geographic correlation recalculated, every prior interview reassessed under unified interpretive parameters. And this time, the system behaves differently. The residual alignment does not weaken under pressure. It stabilizes. Then it tightens. Not through new evidence, but through elimination of competing explanations. Alternative suspect structures fail to sustain multivariable compatibility. Environmental models that previously distributed probability across broader populations collapse under unified constraint testing. Temporal frameworks that once allowed multiple interpretations converge into a narrower operational window. And within that narrowing corridor, one profile remains consistently present. Not as anomaly, but as persistence. At this stage, the investigation enters a phase no longer defined by discovery, but by irreversibility of convergence. Every additional cycle of analysis reduces uncertainty not by revealing new information, but by eliminating structural alternatives that could previously sustain ambiguity. And the system begins to register that shift internally, not as conclusion, but as inevitability. Operational leadership authorizes final procedural escalation, not based on a single piece of evidence, but on the cumulative integrity of cross-system convergence. The threshold has been reached where continued ambiguity introduces greater risk than control validation. A name long present in the background of the system as a persistent residual alignment is formally elevated into active investigative focus. Gary Ridgway. The designation does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as confirmation of structural saturation, where multiple independent analytical systems have already converged on the same bounded outcome without contradiction. The file is no longer treated as speculative. It is treated as operationally prioritized verification target. Historical records are reopened with immediate effect. Prior interviews are recoded under unified analytical indexing. Geographic movement history is reconstructed in full relational mapping. Employment and logistical proximity data are reevaluated under constrained temporal windows aligned with known victimology clusters. The system does not search for a new answer. It tests whether the existing convergence can be broken. It does not break. Every layer of reanalysis reinforces the same structural outcome. No contradictory model survives full system integration. No alternative profile achieves equivalent multi-domain compatibility. Each attempt to displace the residual structure introduces greater inconsistency elsewhere in the framework. The investigative shift is no longer theoretical. It is procedural. Surveillance paramétrée Titan. Historical contact points are reactivated. Prior investigative notes are elevated from archival status into active operational relevance. Every known interaction is reconstructed with forensic precision, not to reevaluate possibility, but to establish continuity across decades of data. And within that continuity, the same pattern persists. Geographic alignment with operational corridors. Temporal compatibility with known disappearance clusters. Behavioral consistency with reconstructed offender mobility models. Still, no single artifact provides absolute proof in isolation. But the system no longer requires isolation. It requires coherence. And coherence has already formed. Outside the investigative core, the transition is not immediately visible. There is no public declaration of resolution. No sudden collapse of uncertainty into clarity. Instead, there's a quiet procedural reorientation. Files moving from open-ended investigation toward targeted verification, resources shifting from exploration to confirmation. But inside the system, the structure has already changed. The case is no longer expanding. It is converging toward execution of final validation protocols. And in that moment, the investigation crosses an invisible threshold that has defined it for decades, the point at which accumulation of alignment becomes more structurally significant than absence of singular proof. The river remains in the background of it all, but it is no longer the source of ambiguity. It has become the silent perimeter around a conclusion that is no longer forming. It is already formed, and what remains is no longer the search for who. It is the final act of confirming what decades of convergence have already made impossible to ignore. By the time the investigation reaches its final operational phase, the structure no longer resembles a case file in motion. It resembles a completed system under final verification. Every component already tested, every alternative already exhausted, every contradiction already resolved or eliminated through repeated cross-system validation. What remains is not discovery. It is confirmation under conditions of total integration. Inside the investigative command structure, activity becomes sharply focused and deliberately narrow. No new theories are generated. No speculative models are introduced. Every action is now anchored to a single objective: verify whether the fully converged analytical outcome remains stable under direct procedural scrutiny. The entire historical dataset is reactivated in synchronized evaluation. Behavioral reconstruction, geographic mapping, forensic archives, temporal clustering models, all run simultaneously under unified constraint parameters. The purpose is no longer exploration of possibility, but stress testing of inevitability. And the result does not deviate. Across every analytical layer, the same residual structure persists. It does not expand. It does not fracture. It does not introduce contradiction when exposed to higher resolution scrutiny. Instead, it holds. Stable, consistent, unbroken across systems that were never originally designed to converge, but now function as a single interpretive architecture. At this stage, investigative language changes subtly but decisively. Terms like probability, hypothesis, and suspicion are gradually replaced with convergent validation, systemic persistence, and multi-domain consistency. The case is no longer discussed in terms of likelihood. It is discussed in terms of structural survivability under full system integration. And within that structure, one residual profile continues to endure every iteration of elimination testing. Not because it resists investigation, but because no alternative configuration survives without introducing internal inconsistency elsewhere in the system. That is the decisive shift. Not emergence of new evidence, but collapse of viable alternatives. At the operational level, this triggers the final phase of procedural escalation. Historical data is re-examined one final time under maximum resolution analytical conditions. Every known movement, every recorded interaction, Every environmental overlap is reconstructed with precision designed to eliminate even marginal uncertainty. The outcome remains unchanged. The same residual alignment persists across all validated models. At this point, the investigation no longer expands outward. It contracts into final confirmation protocol. Within that protocol, the long-standing residual structure, built over decades of integrated behavioral, geographic, and forensic convergence, can no longer be treated as interpretive artifact. It functions as the only remaining configuration that satisfies the total system without contradiction. The investigative focus narrows completely. Historical subject profiles are no longer evaluated as competing possibilities. They are evaluated against a single consolidated outcome derived from full system convergence. And that outcome now carries formal operational designation. Gary Ridgway. The designation does not function as narrative climax. It functions as administrative endpoint of analytical convergence. A structure that has survived every independent test is no longer treated as hypothesis. It is treated as verified subject of final procedural confirmation. Reconstructed timelines are locked. Geographic correlation models are finalized. Behavioral reconstructions are archived as validated system outputs. Forensic interpretations are no longer exploratory. They are confirmatory layers supporting an already stabilized conclusion. What remains is not uncertainty about identity. It is documentation of certainty already established through system-wide convergence. Outside the investigative unit, the transition remains quiet. There is no immediate public rupture of narrative, no dramatic reversal of understanding. Instead, there is procedural normalization, files reclassified, investigative status updated, resources reallocated toward formal case resolution processes. But inside the system, the transformation is complete. The case is no longer open in any analytical sense. It is structurally resolved, pending formal closure procedures that translate convergence into legal finality. And yet, even at this stage, the language of the system remains restrained. Not because doubt persists, but because procedure demands distinction between analytical resolution and judicial confirmation. The river, once treated as the central symbol of uncertainty, no longer carries the weight of mystery. It now functions as historical context, a geographical origin point for a system that has fully reconstructed itself around decades of accumulated evidence and integrated analysis. And in that reconstructed system, nothing remains unresolved except the final administrative act of recognition. Not discovery, not speculation, but confirmation of what sustained cross-system convergence has already established beyond functional doubt.